you so much for joining. If you're new here, we thank you for being here. We are First Draft. If you're not aware of who we are, haven't heard of us, we are a global nonprofit. We have bureaus in Sydney, New York City, and London. We work to give people the tools and knowledge to fight against harmful and misleading information. This is a part of a whole new series of courses all about vaccine misinformation, how to monitor it, how to verify it. Now we're sort of jumping into the end of the course where we're talking about effective reporting and effective communication. So how do we take what we've learned about vaccine misinformation and get out good information? Today's session is going to be all about how to avoid amplifying misinformation. If you're new here, my name is Shay Dene. I'm the Partnerships and Programs Manager based in New York City for First Draft. You can find me on Twitter at @ShayUrbani. At the end of this session, we will also give you some information about how to find more of the organization's resources or get in touch with us. So please stick around for that. And let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So this is our agenda. We're going to go over a few things. The first thing we're going to go over is trends and coordination. So thinking about coordination of misinformation online and how we can avoid being duped by it. We're going to talk about a little case study to help wrap our minds around some of these concepts. Then we're going to talk about the trumpet of amplification as a way of conceptualizing virality and misinformation and sort of how reporters, researchers, and communicators can fit into the landscape of information and how we can make sure we're not amplifying misinformation needlessly. Therefore, the title of the session, and then deciding when to use your platform. So how can we take everything that we've learned and make better decisions about when we use our platform, whether we work for a media organization or a research organization, to get out better information. So let's talk about trends and coordination. So I want you to take a look at this picture on the screen. This is of TweetDeck, if you're not familiar. If you've been to some of our previous sessions, we'll have shown you sort of what this is. It's basically a tool for monitoring different kinds of Twitter feeds all in one place, right? So that's what this is. It's a dashboard for looking at Twitter, if you're not familiar. What we have here is a couple of different columns of hashtags or phrases, and TweetDeck sort of gives you a feed of all the tweets on Twitter that have those hashtags or phrases. So on the left-hand side, we have medical freedom as a hashtag, and then we have medical freedom as a phrase, and we do not consent as a hashtag, and then informed consent. So what's interesting about the results when you type these things into TweetDeck or Twitter, you do a search for them, and you look at the results that come up for these hashtags and phrases, is that they're all about vaccines. That wouldn't necessarily be obvious just looking at these hashtags, right? Medical freedom is a sort of vague general phrase. You can imagine it meaning a number of different things, right? But right now, when we look at these hashtags, the conversation is dominated by people who are talking about vaccines. We do not consent, in particular, was a hashtag that became very popular in the UK. So that's what that's been in reference to. But the thread here is that all of these are about vaccines. Another thing that's interesting is that when you look at the difference in the results between medical freedom as a hashtag and medical freedom as a phrase, there are some slight differences. So medical freedom as a hashtag is very much dominated by people who are skeptical of the vaccine or who are anti the COVID vaccine or vaccines in general. And they're sort of using this hashtag as a way to say that the vaccines are being forced on us by the government, right? sort of plays into this narrative we talked about before about civil liberties as a concern for people with regards to the vaccine. On the other hand, when you look at medical freedom as a phrase, some people who use the phrase are using it in terms of speaking out against forced vaccinations. Some people who are using it are referring to people who are speaking out against forced vaccination. So in other words, people who are pro-vaccine who are talking about the anti-vaccine community. And it's sort of an obvious point, but the reason I highlight it is to say that, you know, often when people use hashtags as opposed to just a phrase in their tweet, they're sort of sloganizing the language, right? They're using this term medical freedom as a slogan and as a way to collect their point of view in one place. So then when you click on the hashtag medical freedom, you're going to see a whole bunch of people who are talking about the vaccine under this framework of a threat to civil liberties, right? This is something that we call keyword squatting. So keyword squatting is a fancy way of saying the strategic domination of keywords. So using a keyword or a phrase and populating that keyword with your point of view such that if someone were looking at that hashtag or clicked on that hashtag on Twitter, they would see a feed of all of these people who sort of were trying to communicate your same general message, right? This is a term that that was originally coined by Data and Society in their report Source Hacking. If you're not familiar with Data and Society, they have a whole bunch of interesting reports regarding misinformation, how misinformation travels, and how reporters and communicators can be thinking about it. So I definitely suggest taking a look at that. So let's look at some other examples of keyword squatting. So one is hashtag Save the Children. So this is a slogan that went very popular in the US around the time of the US election. Again, when you look at the hashtag Save the Children, it has a sort of vague quality to it, right? A very innocuous one at that as well. When you hear Save the Children, you think, oh, well, of course, like what, some message about children and protecting children, right? And this was a hashtag that was adopted by very QAnon adjacent community. So basically a community of people who think that there is a political conspiracy dominated by left-wing politicians that are facilitating the abuse of children, specifically the sexual abuse of children and pedophilia and all of that. You may be familiar if you're tuning in from other countries with QAnon movements in your country as well. But at a certain point, they started tweeting this hashtag Save the Children. And again, if you didn't realize that Save the Children was connected to the QAnon conspiracy, you might just think that this is a general movement to protect children, right? Because of the vague language. Here's another less, well, I shouldn't say less political example, but maybe a more fun example. Also, at a certain point, the hashtag went viral, impeach Biden now, right? So largely a right-wing hashtag, people who were upset with Biden. And this got dominated by K-pop fans. So K-pop fans basically adopted this hashtag and then filled it with their own K-pop content, right? And so it was sort of this fun, lighthearted way to take a political hashtag and then flood it with something that was totally unrelated. So that's why we call it keyword squatting. It's sort of adopting this hashtag and then dominating it with, you know, the content or agenda of your choosing. And it can be done in lots of different ways. This can also be done with sound as well. So this is an example from TikTok. If you're not familiar with TikTok, one of the features of TikTok is that you can use audio on the platform for your own videos, right? And so what will happen is there will be a piece of audio, and then if you're creating new content, you can grab that audio and use it. You can also search things according to audio. So you can click on a particular piece of audio and then see all of the different videos that have used that sound, right? So around the time of the election before in October, there was a song that had been going around called Trump is Your President. And originally, the videos that were using this audio were basically patriotic posts, people who are Trump supporters, American flags, MAGA hats, right? People who were using this sound, Trump is your president, for something that you would expect them to use it for. And then there was another K-pop takeover. So around October, we started to see a flood of K-pop related content on this sound, right? So this is just to say that keyword squatting is something that can be done in lots of different formats and mediums as well. So let's take a case study because the point of this, of course, is to think about how this should inform our reporting or communication around misinformation, right? So I want to go back to Save the Children, which I know is not a vaccine example, but it's a really good way of showing how researchers, reporters, communicators can play a role in amplifying misinformation or an agenda inadvertently, right? So when Save the Children blew up as a hashtag, our team did a little investigating into where this hashtag was first being used and what were sort of the events and real world things that were happening in relation to the hashtag. Like what was the on the ground movement or the real world, not just online movement regarding this hashtag, right? One of the things that we found was that there were a lot of rallies being organized all over the United States with the slogan, Save the Children. On Facebook, one of the main organizers of a lot of these rallies was this person who calls himself John De La Cruz, who claims to be based in Los Angeles. What we found was it was very immediate that this person was clearly connected to or adjacent to the QAnon conspiracy. And we know that from looking at the language in their posts. So if you look at these hashtags, you see things like Hollywood, Los Angeles, Save the Children, Save Our Children. And then, you see these things like child lives matter and human trafficking. But then you see this at the end, WWG1WGA. And if you're not familiar with QAnon and the language that has sort of evolved around that conspiracy, then you might not know that this is one of the most popular hashtags that believers in QAnon tweet or post. It stands for where we go on, we go. Where we go one, we go all. Interpret that how you will, but it's one of the things that they tweet. And so this was a signal to us that this is someone who is part of the QAnon conspiracy. So it's just to say that, when you're looking at a trend or a hashtag that's gone viral on whatever social media platform, it's important to investigate the sources if you're going to understand the context surrounding it. Because again, if you didn't do this, you might just think that Save the Children was, an innocuous movement of people who were concerned about child safety, right? Or sexual abuse. But when you just dig in a little bit, you discover that actually it's very connected to a specific conspiratorial community. Another thing that we found pretty quickly is evidence of coordination as well. So this is a screenshot from 4chan. And if you read this small text on the screen, you can see that it says Save the Children, hashtag Save Our Children, use these hashtags. And then it goes on to say this stuff about the world waking up to satanic, pedophilic cabal, you know, what we have come to know as your general QAnon conspiratorial crazy talk, right? The point here is that this is a post telling people to use these hashtags. Why is that important? It's important because sometimes when we're looking at trends or hashtags that are going viral, you know, any kind of trend on social media, there can be a tendency to think that that trend is organic, right? But actually, it's very easy to make something go trending, especially if you are telling people to use these hashtags. So that's why we need to investigate trends on Twitter, is because you don't want to be duped into thinking something is organic when really there is a coordinated movement behind it. What made this blow up, though, really, this Save the Children movement, slogan, whatever you want to call it, is that it then got filtered through local media and mainstream media. So what you can see on the right is a little Google News search for these slogans. And you can see that there were a bunch of local media reports on the rallies that were being held around the US that basically just said that these rallies existed. Save the Children March to be held Saturday, right? Group plans Save the Children March. Basically just announcing the marches. And what was sort of problematic or strange about that to us is that these headlines don't put Save the Children into context, right? They're not saying to their audiences, oh, this is connected to a very pointed political conspiracy, right? It's just sort of announcing the fact of these rallies, right? And that's important because you have this movement that is very much online and comes from online communities, and then that gains a broader platform via local media, repeating it in their headlines and writing all these stories about it, right? So this is an example of what we call the trumpet of amplification. So the idea that misinformation often starts in niche communities like the anonymous web. So the anonymous web being something like 4chan or Discord, or even Reddit, right? Spaces where people are using anonymous identities, right? Then it moves through closed networks, maybe a WhatsApp group, right? A contained sort of network of people. Then sometimes it moves into an even broader audience, right? So you have conspiracy communities on YouTube, for example. Then there's social media. That's sort of the next most broad category. Twitter, Facebook, platforms where there is a large percentage of the population active. And then sort of the broadest platform is professional media, right? So we call it a trumpet because at sort of the beginning, you have communities that are more niche, where if there's misinformation, okay, but it might not be necessarily reaching a lot of people. And then you have something like professional media, where if you talk about misinformation at that level, it's giving a very broad platform to to a piece of misinformation, bringing misinformation to a large audience. So this is something we think about, because when we're reporting on misinformation, we don't want to amplify it needlessly, right? So it's very important to think about our role in how we talk about misinformation and whether or not we're just providing a larger platform for it. And this is very important in particular with trends. So that's why when we talk about trends on social media, we always tell reporters to proceed with caution. One thing that we learned doing a tour around the US, talking to different reporters around the US ahead of the US election, is that a lot of newsrooms have it as as just sort of a standard to look at the trends on Twitter for possible story ideas. And this is not to say that reporters shouldn't be doing that, because sometimes there are interesting stories in the things that you see trending on Twitter, but it's to say to be careful, right? Because sometimes those trends are not organic, right? And sometimes they are interesting stories, but you don't want to report them without context, right? In the case of Save the Children, it was really about the fact that these rallies were being reported without context and without an explanation of how they were connected back to a very specific conspiratorial political movement. So on the note of context, this is a really great example of reporting on the Save the Children phenomenon that put that trend into context. So this is an example from NBC. They have some very good mis and disinformation reporting that they do. And the headline is QAnon looms behind nationwide rallies and viral Save the Children hashtags. So what's great about this headline is that they're reporting on Save the Children, but even just in the headline, they're immediately putting it into context, showing how it's connected to a political conspiracy theory, right? And we're going to talk a lot more about headlines and our tips for how to do this in our next session. So I hope that you join us for that. Amplification can happen with images too. So, you know, images really builds a narrative. So when we're talking about amplification and how reporting can inadvertently give a broader platform to a rumor, well, images play a role in that, right? You can also sort of build a narrative by way of having the same kind of images in your reporting. So one thing that we've seen is photos like this in a lot of news stories, where it's sort of like a person grimacing, right, when they're getting the vaccine. That is very compelling, right? It sort of it shows it's a very emotive way of talking about pain and the vaccine. And that might not be the message you're trying to send with your article, right? So when you have a series of articles of news outlets, you know, that have images like this that are very evocative of pain and possibly fear, it doesn't necessarily matter if the article itself is subtle and well reported, right? Because the image is very provocative in itself. So that's something to think about as well. And this is why, you know, we teach people that it's important to understand what the trends and dominant narratives regarding vaccines are online. So if you joined us for previous sessions, you know that Bill Gates is a very is a very popular figure in sort of the conspiratorial thinking around vaccines and like narratives of population control and how Bill Gates wants to, you know, depopulate the world, right? So if you are an outlet reporting on something regarding Bill Gates and vaccines, maybe that's just something to think about, right? Because his image is inevitably going to be repurposed, screenshotted, and used as part of this conspiratorial narrative, right? It's not to say don't use images of Bill Gates where it's relevant, right? But it's just to understand how images fit into broader narratives that we see online. Sometimes narratives are very connected to misinformation. Another thing that we see a lot is, you know, dominant frameworks that get repeated over and over. So in particular, reporting personal anecdotes as news. So again, you can see in this example from the New York Times, we have this image of, you know, the vaccine. But this article in particular is about a Boston physician who had an allergic reaction following the coronavirus vaccine. This is part of a huge wave of reporting we've seen of reactions to the vaccine, right? And of course, reporting on reactions to the vaccine is very important, right? We need to give people good information about the potential risks that they may be facing, right? But as with anything, like we've said in this presentation, it's important to put those things into context, right? So what we've seen is that even though actually when you look at the full picture, allergic reaction to the vaccine is very small and it's very low risk because there are so many articles reporting on specific instances of it as if it's news. It can feel like a broader phenomenon to your audience than it actually is, right? And that can be misleading in its own way because we're trying to help people understand risk accurately, right? Another thing to think about in terms of amplifying misinformation and doing it responsibly is attribution, right? So in these stories about risk and reactions to the vaccine, one of the things that we've seen is an attempt to sort of undermine specifically Pfizer, but other vaccines by certain misinformation outlets. So this is RT, this is Russia Today, this is the Russia-funded news service that is popular, especially in Spanish-speaking communities, actually. And this is a segment they ran on severe reactions to Pfizer. And the reason I bring this up as an example is it can be very easy to say that this undermining of Pfizer, in particular this way, is like a Russia-sponsored narrative, right? And to sort of pin the blame on a particular state, right? Or a particular agent. But it's more complicated than that, right? Because actually there are tons of Western news outlets, this is a screenshot from the New York Times, that are writing articles that are pretty much the same, right? And so I think especially since 2016 and the US election, there's been great concern about foreign influence and state-sponsored misinformation, but you have to be very careful not to attribute something to a particular state or a particular country without hard evidence, right? So it's just something to think about. Finally, we're just going to cover one more concept, which is deciding when to use your platform and how to do that. So, we talk about amplification in terms of, when to report on misinformation, and it could be complicated because on the one hand, if misinformation is getting no engagement, then reporting on it or debunking a rumor might just spread the rumor more widely. On the other hand, if you wait till misinformation goes viral, it can be very hard to slow that rumor down. So what we're constantly trying to do is to identify that sweet spot right before something goes viral, but you expect that it might have the potential to, so that you can get out good information so that when people start searching for it, they find the quality information, right? And we call that sweet spot the tipping point. And all of this is about sort of weighing that danger of potentially amplifying misinformation versus public interest, right? Asking yourself, what is the public interest in reporting on this misinformation? And how can I weigh that against the possibility of amplifying it? So unfortunately, there's no science to identifying the tipping point or making this decision about when to report on misinformation. We have this, this little sort of nifty mental trick called point that you can remember. And these are basically just a series of different things to think about to help you make that decision about whether you should report on something. So one is to think about platforms. Is it moving from one platform to another? Another is to think about outlets. Are journalists and publishers writing about it, right? If we think about that trumpet of amplification, if another journalist is writing about it or another media outlet is writing about it, then chances are a lot of people are talking about it or seeing that information, right? Another thing to think about is influencers. Did an influencer share a piece of information, misinformation, a celebrity, or if you have a smaller audience, to think about who is influential for your audience, and did that person share misinformation? Another is numbers. So just what is the raw engagement on something? How many shares did it get? How many likes did it get? And then finally, travel. Is it moving from one community to another? So this is very similar to platforms, right? But just to think more about the people who are on those platforms. So are you seeing it move from one niche community to a different niche community? Or in the case of platforms, are you seeing it on Twitter, but you're also seeing it in these Facebook groups? All of these things can sort of serve as indicators of whether a piece of misinformation is getting a lot of spread. One tool that can help you do this is the CrowdTangle link checker. This is a great free tool. You can install it on Firefox or Google Chrome. And it's basically something that you install, and when you click on the website, if you then click on the plugin, it will show you where it's been shared on social media. So this can help you identify people who are spreading misinformation, but it can also just sort of help you quantify how much spread it's getting and whether it's something you should be concerned by. And then, spread, again, going back to this concept that making these decisions is an art rather than a science, you really have to think about the community that you're serving. Spread depends on the community that you're looking at. So this is an example of something that we've seen a lot. It's people using the adverse event reporting system by the CDC to make claims about the safety and efficacy of the virus. Basically, it's a system that allows you to report adverse events to the CDC, but they're not verified, and anyone can put in a report, and so you can't then rely on it for accurate data. But we've seen it used to make a wide variety of claims. This is a Telegram group that we saw it repeated on. And if you saw this piece of misinformation in a Telegram group, you might think, oh, well, that's just spreading in that Telegram group. It's not on Twitter, so I don't need to think about it. But if you're working with a community where this is a place where a lot of people are talking and getting their news, then maybe you pay more attention to it. Maybe you do report on it.